kicking, biting, spitting, headbutting, you name it, he'll do it. So almost not far short of like trying to deal with a wild animal really is how to deal with it. And at this point he's then tried to kick me in the head, and his boot's gone up at the side of my head and come back down and it's hit me somewhere around the midriff or whatever. So I've leant forward, jabbed him on the nose.
What were you actually charged with?
I was charged with a common assault. I had a full-on mental breakdown because of it. And I literally burst out crying on the hour, every half hour, whatever, for about 3 weeks. My only way out of it was going to be hanging myself. I literally thought it's the final punishment and it's the only way out. If he'd have put his hands up and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, my mistake, I forgot to send you this," I've not really got an argument. It's all a mistake, innit? But no, he didn't. He just kept lying and he kept trying to hide the evidence, and he just lied and lied and lied repeatedly and just twisted it and just tried absolutely anything. And instead of actually going to court and making an appeal and providing any case progress or anything like that, they just requested repeated adjournments. My actions were proportionate and necessary. There was clearly no misconduct.
Welcome back to the Pocket Sergeant podcast. My guest today is former Sergeant Lee Jones. Lee was charged following an incident in custody. The criminal case was later dropped. He then faced gross misconduct proceedings and was found to have no case to answer. But what is alleged to have happened behind the scenes raises serious questions. Lee, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Nice to meet you.
Can you take us back to that day in custody? What actually happened?
Yeah, I'll try and sort of break it down into simplistic chunks. I was the custody sergeant. We had a guy in who we'd all met before, and and I'm sure you'll know from experience, you get these people that come in that won't engage on any level, and essentially they almost behave like animals, won't cooperate, won't even speak to you, kicking, biting, spitting, headbutting, you name it, he'll do it. So almost not far short of like trying to deal with a wild animal really is how to deal with him. We brought him into the custody suite, or the officers brought him into the custody suite, and I tried repeatedly over about, I think it was 12, 13 minutes, something like that, to engage with him, to go through the risk assessment. Clearly, if you go through the risk assessment, you can start to get dialogue, and you get any sort of dialogue, you can start to kind of make a bit of a deal or some sort of agreement or whatever. So that's kind of the standard stuff, and obviously you're obliged to do that, and I did that as in as much detail as I possibly could.
So was this at the custody desk?
At this stage, I'm behind the custody desk, and we've tried for 12, 13 minutes, and all we've got out of him is grunting and kicking and screaming. So he's handcuffed at this stage. He then offers to spit at somebody. He headbutts somebody, and then someone puts a spit hood on him. So he's handcuffed, sat on a chair because he wouldn't hold his own body weight. So he's very difficult to deal with, and he's just sort of grunting and howling like an animal, really. So in order to sort of alter the dynamic, at the last throw of the dice to sort of see, look, can we get any dialogue? Because otherwise we've got to throw him in the cell like a sack of potatoes, like we did in the old days, which I'm always reluctant to do because I think we know the problem that leads to. So let's try again. So I went round the front of the desk to see if we could engage with him differently. And at this point, I've got to admit, I took my eye off the ball a little bit. I've stood too close to him. He kind of screwed himself up in a little ball, which was a bit strange. And the guy is very, very strange. And as he screwed himself up in a little ball, I've kind of leant in to think, what on earth is he doing? And at this point, he's then tried to kick me in the head, and his boot's gone up at the side of my head and come back down, and it's hit me somewhere around the midriff or whatever. So at that stage, we've sort of all frozen at the idea, and nobody knew what to do with him because he's just so chaotic. So I've leant forward, jabbed him on the nose, and then a colleague has taken him to the floor, and he's been carried into a cell. Now, in terms of that jab to the nose, it's not a Mike Tyson haymaker. It's literally an arm length punch, just using the weight of my arm, just to stop him in what he's doing, because he's one of these people that's so unpredictable and so violent, you've just got no idea what he's going to do next. And his track record of assaulting police officers, he's assaulted more police officers than anybody else in the history of Derbyshire, particularly when he's being taken to a cell. So clearly somebody's got to do something to just get him under control. Now, I get it, it might, to some people, might sound a bit rough and ready, it might sound unpleasant, and it is. But somebody's got to do something. That's what I did. And then he went into a cell far more peacefully than usual, no injury caused to him.
Yeah.
And then he sorry, go on.
Yeah, so I want to touch on that then. So you jabbed into the nose, and what response did you get instantly after that?
Well, the response I was looking for, essentially, he sort of it startled him, and it wasn't much more than much more than a startling effect. It was certainly never. There was no weight behind it, and I was wrong-footed to try and put my body weight behind it. Anyway, it's just a jab. And he just sort of wobbled his head back, and then someone grabbed hold of him, because he's just so difficult to deal with, so unpredictable that you've just got to take him by surprise. And essentially that's what happened. We got him in the cell, and immediately he went in the cell, and just to sort of illustrate the length of his behaviour, he then decided he needed to go to the toilet at the rear end, and he proceeded to poo in his hands and throw it at everyone. This is the kind of guy and that's the level he's at. That's normal for him. That's who he is. He's got some sort of reduced learning capacity, reduced IQ, I understand. He's been in and out of mental health care. He's a very, very difficult individual to manage.
What had he been locked up for?
He'd assaulted his brother. I think basically him and his brother had a punch-up. His brother had hit him, he'd hit his brother, and I think they decided at the scene that he was the more aggressive of the two, so they brought him in, I think.
When you jabbed into the nose, was there any sort of visible injuries caused?
No. To be fair, the jab was a pretty controlled thing. It was something that put it this way: if I'd jabbed you on the arm at that sort of weight and power, we would just have a laugh about it. It'd be like that joke kind of power if it was on your arm. Obviously, it'd be a bit more annoying on your nose, but it certainly wasn't what you'd call a weighty thump or anything like that.
You said that he'd headbutted somebody prior to the jab. Who had he headbutted?
Well, the officers escorting him. They'd stood too close, and he'd swung his head at him. But it's kind of how he is. If you go within his range, he's almost, if you like, you can almost see him calculating ways to try and assault people. It is very, very strange to deal with.
Explain the process around placing him in the cell straight after.
Well, he was escorted to the cell by the officers who were with him, and then he's one of those people, you can't put him in a cell and just shut the cell door. He's got to be restrained physically in the cell afterwards. And certainly the previous time we had him in the cell, he was taken to a cell physically, restrained en route to the cell, and restrained for about 6 hours solid post entry to the cell, because he just wouldn't cooperate at all, wouldn't calm down at all. I think the time before that, I'd had his handcuffs and such like taken off him, and he'd actually smashed the plaster off the walls and slit his wrists with the shards of plaster, and obviously almost killed himself, ended up in hospital. So you're sort of very, very difficult person to manage, probably the highest dependency individual we'd ever had in the custody suite, just an absolute time bomb.
Did he have mental capacity?
Yes, he had mental capacity. He's got learning issues. He's got reduced, if you like, mental capacity, most certainly. But he knows what he's doing. And the odd thing about it is I'd discussed it the previous time I had him in. I'd discussed it with a mental health practitioner who'd come and taken him to their facility about just what capacity he'd got. So I knew he'd got that capacity. But he kind of functions like a poorly educated 12-year-old or something. He kind of like that, really.
So he knows the difference between right and wrong?
Yeah, he absolutely did. Absolutely. And it's quite clear. The strange thing about it, just to illustrate the capacity, is that there's obviously a fitness to detain process that you would carry out with a nurse, and there's the medication process that you carry out with the nurse in the custody suite. So we've got this guy who's sat there, and he's sat there for 6 hours, screaming, crying, wailing, like an animal, not cooperating at all. And then one of the detention officers takes the nurse into the custody, into the cell, to discuss the prospect of giving him some medication to calm him down. Well, he wants his medication, so the nurse, obviously, before she issues him with medication, has to go in the cell, escorted by me, has to go in the cell and discuss the notion of whether he's fit to be medicated. So obviously she wouldn't medicate someone who's non-compos mentis. So she has the conversation of, do you know where you are? Do you know what you're doing? And he answers all these things in a straightforward and level manner that indicates he knows full well what's going off. And then he has his medication and goes to sleep. But he's had 6 hours of just screaming and wailing and pretending, and it is all an act, that he doesn't know where he is. But the minute the nurse goes in his cell, he knows exactly where he is, and he answers the questions perfectly and lucidly. So clearly he knows what he's doing.
And you've obviously had past dealings with him as well prior to then. Is there any sort of training that prepares you for that sort of moment?
Well, you've got the irony is you've got your personal safety training, which you do every year, and that's your training. But as I explained in the interview, I've never had any sort of fight with somebody who's sat in a chair. I don't know what you're supposed to do with somebody who's sat in a chair in front of you when you're almost on top of them. And I appreciate I've kind of misjudged the distance myself. I'm not saying that my judgment wasn't flawed or anything, because I've got myself assaulted, and yes, it's a mistake on my part. But that's it on my part. That's what's happened, and it has led to that. But the reality is, when I've been trying to negotiate with him for those 12, 13 minutes, everybody else has given up on him already at that point. I've not. I'm trying to get some dialogue. But the minute he starts kicking out at me, the dialogue's over, and he's effectively made the decision for me. He's going in a cell. So I've kind of lost the situation. I appreciate I have, but likewise, what you're supposed to do, I've done the best I could with it. But some days, as you know, in custody, you're just a second away from chaos, because that's how it is.
The dialogue between you both before this happened, what sort of things were you saying to him and asking him?
For me, it was a case of, obviously there's the script, there's the, are you on any medication, do you have any illnesses, all that kind of stuff, that just the standard stuff, and just trying to relay that information and just trying to open that conversation with him. But I never got past the first couple of questions, because I never got an answer to any of them after sort of 12, 13 minutes, And
from what you've said, you clearly believe that the use of force was lawful and necessary at the time in custody.
Yeah, I think the thing is you can weigh it up however you want to, but if you want to sort of test whether a police officer's assaulted somebody unlawfully, I think you've got 3 real questions really. The first one would be, is it a Home Office approved technique? I think the second one would be, is there a legitimate purpose for that use of force? And the third one would be, has there been a significant injury caused? And I would think that, if you satisfy all those criteria, that it's Home Office approved technique with a legitimate reason behind it, and you've not caused any significant injury, I don't think you should be looking at a crime. I don't see how it can be a crime. I think if you fall foul of one of those criteria, then you've got difficulties, because you're out of the sphere, aren't you? But if it's a yes to all those 3 and everything's in line with all those 3 criteria, well, we shouldn't even be looking at it on a criminal basis, should we? There's no need.
Mm. When did you first realise that this might become a criminal investigation?
It was oddly, I think a lot of police officers go through the career wondering that when someone's going to be tiptoeing down the corridor on a Monday morning for them, and then spring such a thing as a surprise on them. I literally went into work in custody on a Monday morning, and at whatever it was, 7:30 Monday morning, they sprang out down the corridor and sprang it on me.
Tell me about that moment.
I think the thing for me was that initially I was kind of confused, because I sort of said, well, all right, you've got to investigate it. And I appreciate it's a thing. There's no part of me that thinks it doesn't require explanation. And there's no part of me that thinks they haven't got a right to ask. Of course they've got a right to ask, and if they want to investigate it, it's fine. But I was of the mind that, right, if you want to investigate it, well, arrange an interview whenever. I'll go back to work. And they said, no, you're not going back to work. I said, what do you mean I'm not going back to work? Of course, I'm on duty. Why would I not go back to work? And it's then you realise that they're taking it far more serious than I thought it was. I was sort of sat there thinking, well, this can't possibly become criminal. And I don't see how I could ever end up being sacked for it, because nothing's happened. There's no injury. There's nothing, and clearly I am doing my job. I don't think there's any debate that I was doing my job. I'm doing my job. if I've done it badly, maybe I've done it badly. Maybe I deserve a warning. I don't know. But the fact of the matter is, I was clearly doing my job, and I just thought, well, surely the ceiling to this would be management advice or something. But why they were taking it so serious was, at that time, at that point, it was absolutely beyond me.
Assuming this was professional standards.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And they collared you before you signed on duty, is that right?
No, I'd already started, and the first thing I know is another custody sergeant turned up, and we had the sort of, what are you doing here? Conversation, and then they arrived.
So how did that pan out then? Did you just have to sit in a room with them and they serve papers at that time?
Yeah, they served papers, and then we arranged an interview. And I went to headquarters and I had a full criminal interview with a solicitor and all such like.
Where did the complaint come from?
Well, that's the odd thing is that the complaint's a different matter. There was never a complaint, and there's a complex discussion around that one. My thoughts are that I'd made the custody inspector aware, and I said, look, this is what's happened. By all means, have a look at it. I recorded it on the custody record. I recorded it on my statement. I'd done it in front of 3 or 4 other officers. We all knew what had happened.
And it's all on CCTV as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's on 12 cameras or whatever that's all covering the custody suite. So there's nothing to hide. I've documented it all. And I said, look, just have a look at it, and if you want to have a word kind of thing. And anyway, he didn't have a word. He clearly was over his head, and he went to professional standards with it. But as for a complaint, we might as well bridge that gap now. The guy never made a complaint against me. What actually happened was, as part of their submission, but bearing in mind he's assaulted me and got charged with an assault on me, they tried to negate the assault on me on the basis that he didn't know where he was or what he was doing, totally unaware of what he was doing. And then they obtained a complaint from him saying, please give us an account of what happened to you in the custody suite on the 22nd of June 2020. Well, he's actually then gone into an account which was totally unrelated. He's given an account of when he was, whether it's assaulted or whether another officer's used force on him on a separate occasion, but he clearly describes a completely different incident. And he goes on about it for quite some time and describes a variety of use of forces and some circumstances which are totally not related to this incident at all. And they never clarify. At this point, you would think, if you're investigating this, you would think that the PSD officer would say, can you tell me who the officer is who's hit you? Was it at the custody desk? Was it the custody? No, nothing like that ever happened. They just went, oh, thanks very much. There's your account, and then pinned it on me. But he was clearly referring to an incident from like a year previous in which he had assaulted a couple of officers whilst he'd been handcuffed, and they'd had a proper schmozzle with him. And it was clearly that he was describing when you saw the transcript of it. But they just essentially said, well, that's... And we'll see why that went through in a minute, because there's something else that they did which meant that went through unchallenged, which it shouldn't have done.
Was he was he charged for the assault on the other officer as well, the headbutt?
Yes. But they certainly, some months down the line, well, he was charged, but because he's in and out of a variety of sort of mental health facilities and that, he got waylaid for quite some time. Certainly the charge against me was dropped in order to accommodate my gross misconduct hearing.
Right, okay. Had you been investigated previously?
No.
For anything?
No.
How many years had you done up until that point?
16, 17, something like that.
Okay, and you'd never been investigated before?
No. I mean,
I'd
had papers served a couple of times, but it was, back in the day, in the early noughties, where they just used to serve papers on everybody, and then they'd scrap it after a few days. Just a couple of those, that was all. Never been interviewed or anything.
After your interview with PSD, then, I take it that was a criminal interview initially?
Yeah, it was 90 minutes worth of interview in which I explained all the pitfalls of having to deal with this guy and all my reasoning for doing what I'd done.
What was that like, being on the other side?
It's not pleasant, and the way they conducted it wasn't pleasant either. It wasn't a pace interview as I would recognise it, and certainly that's something I used to train officers in. So I feel like I know what I'm talking about. It was more of a character assassination than anything else, but certainly in terms of satisfying the criteria, they never got there really. They just essentially tried to tell me I was wrong throughout most of it, really.
Okay. What were you actually charged with in the end?
I was charged with a common assault.
Okay. And what sort of impact did that have on you, both mentally and physically?
Actually, still troubles me a little bit now to talk about it, but I'm detached from it now. The book helped me detach from it, I've got to say. All things, to try and paraphrase it as quickly as possible, I had a full-on mental breakdown because of it. And I would say I'm recovered in a lot of ways now, but there's parts of you that never will. And it just is what it is. I just could not comprehend the reality that I was in.
There are obviously a lot of police officers that be able to resonate with this.
Yeah.
But what did a mental breakdown look like from your perspective?
In terms of describing it's an odd one because I'm, if you like, you've got your persona as a police officer, if you like, and if you like, I've gone for 16, 17 years. I'm the standard. I never waver. I never give any emotional response. I'm the calm head. I'm in charge. I'm the sergeant. I know the answer to every question. I might have led myself to believe that, and it might not be 100% accurate, but that's certainly who I believed myself to be. So I'm not an emotional guy. You get some officers that get upset by things. I've never shed a tear. I've never sort of lost it or anything at work or anything like that. And in terms of me crying, it happened when my granddad died or when my daughter was born. Very, very infrequent during my adult life. And oddly, I got told I was being charged. Bearing in mind, I'd had several arguments with them by this stage because I knew that what they were doing was wrong. So they got a mate of mine to ring me who was repping for me, lovely guy, brilliant guy, Dave. And he told me I was being charged. And my bottom lip went, and I started crying. And then oddly, I thought, right, I've had me outburst. I'll go and have a cup of tea or whatever. Deal with it, thinking of that because I'm the adult, I'm composed, I am this authority figure, that's who I am. And then I went to make a cup of tea and I went again. And I literally burst out crying on the hour, every half hour, whatever, for about 3 weeks. And it's like, what's going off? Never been like it before. And it was almost like weird that my brain was doing it, the chemicals were coming and I was starting to burst out crying. And then I would get the emotion would run out and dry up. And then I'd start again as soon as I could. Just sort of ceased to be a functioning adult for a while. And then gradually, as the weeks went by while I was on bail, I found some equilibrium with it and started to cope with it, But it's damaging. I think for me, when you look at the value that you've got, that you think, yeah, I turn up to work, I work hard, I'm competent, I know what I'm doing, I believe I'm doing the right thing, and I've always tried to do the right thing. I'm one of the good guys. That's I know some people want to identify as a cat or a dog or whatever, but I identified as a police officer who was trying to do a good job and serve people and uphold the law, which is a standard, I think, and it's a part of your character. And it died, literally just died that day,
How did it affect your family life?
My daughter, I think when it started, was about 10, and that became a difficult relationship. I certainly had some questionable parenting issues, shall we say. I think my wife soldiered on through it pretty gamely, but she was pretty tired of it by the end. I think if it was what I would have said is, prior to this, we were a happy family and entirely, I was very happily married, as was she. I think if we'd have been perhaps under the strain, if there'd have been some strain within our marriage and our family prior to that, it would have broken it. But we got through it. We're okay now. When I say I'm okay now, I'm a happy man now. I'm not a basket case. I'm not the man I was, but I'm certainly settled with it.
You say you're not the man you were. How's that changed?
I think you have a lot of counselling, and I had quite a lot of counselling, and you start to reassemble things, and you find that just whereas before, I'm ex-army, and then I had a year or so out, and then I joined the police, and the police was a constant stream of conflict, death, and danger, as you know, and I think I'd just run my course, if you like, and I've had to discuss it at length with a psychiatrist, and she's essentially said, you've had your fill. If you go back to work and start carrying on with this, carrying on with that, you're just going to be back in this state again. You can't keep doing it. Your brain's just done. So now, I don't know, it's kind of strange, but I'm now, what's the word? I'm a lot less decisive than it used to be. I'm a lot milder than I used to be, which perhaps is a good thing, But I step back, whereas I used to be the person who, no matter what, come what may, whatever the weather, I stepped forward and I took responsibility and I resolved whatever that issue is, whatever the violence, whatever the danger, whatever. I'm in charge, I'll sort it out. I'm now someone who steps back and thinks, I can't do that. So that's kind of where I've become, and that's how I live my life now, a bit more insular, I think.
How long did it take from when you were interviewed by professional standards to get it right the way to court?
Now then, I was interviewed in September. The incident was June. I was interviewed at the start of September. They took around 8 weeks going to CPS with it. And, excuse me, the 8 weeks to CPS struck me as a bit strange because it never... I know they have this sort of scheme where they go to CPS as a matter of course, but it never needed to go to CPS. You don't approach CPS if you're looking to knock it on the head. Never have, never will. I don't know why they would have approached CPS with it, because there wasn't really a substantive charge there based on the evidence. Never should have been. But they approached CPS, and that took sort of 8-9 weeks, and CPS then came back with the charge. And then it was, because it was during COVID, it was the middle of February before I got to my first hearing. So I've had getting on for 6 months as an investigation by the time I've got to court. I've then gone to court, pled not guilty. I got some sort of relief magistrate who, when I said, am I getting bail? He said, I don't know. I thought, nice one. Yeah. So fortunately, I was the divisional advisor on the Bail Act, so I had to school him in court on how to bail me out of court. And but for a second, I wondered if I was staying the night, and as unrealistic as that sounds, it's pretty tense on the day, when you're stressed up to the eyeballs. But I got bailed out, and I made a defence statement within a week or two of that. And the defence statement was little more than to reiterate what I'd explained in interview. And the strange thing is the criminal case against me fell to pieces on the back of that defence statement, which was only the same things I'd said in interview, which was mystifying, or at that point it was mystifying. I know why it happened now.
Tell me about that then.
Right, well, essentially, and it took me a year or so to work this out, what they'd done was, firstly, the complaint that they took from him that actually related to someone else. And I know which officer it was, but the complaint they got from him related to another incident with another officer. The reason CPS didn't pick up on the fact that complaint was about another officer was because when they submitted the file for him and for the charge, they didn't link his details to the prosecution case. So instead of getting opposing charges, so bearing in mind he's charged with an assault on me and I'm charged with an assault on him, which straight away is a big no-no for CPS because one effectively cancels out the other because one justifies the other, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The opposing charges, CPS did not know because CPS did not see his record because it wasn't attached to the file. So what they got, instead of this guy who's the maddest, most unpredictable, wildest most difficult to control person on earth who's assaulted more police officers than anybody else I've ever met, is a clean criminal record, and a youth described as a vulnerable male with learning difficulties. So all CPS ever knew was that he was a vulnerable male with learning difficulties, and all they knew in respect to the complaint was that he was complaining of being assaulted by a police officer. And so they didn't attach any of that, any of his history or anything wasn't attached to the file. So they weren't aware of the opposing charge, and they weren't aware of his extensive criminal record, and dealt with him as an innocent party, so to speak. Now, beyond that, the big bugbear was that I'd explained in detail why I'd done it. I'm in charge of the custody suite. I've got to get him into a cell. I've got to get him under control. That's life, you know. And what they'd done is they withheld the interview transcript, 90-minute interview, and they'd just gone on an MG, I've been retired for a year too. What's the form for a
6?
15, 16, the interview summary.
Oh, right, okay.
Oh, man, I'm getting on.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Sorry, I lost it a bit there. They just put a summary on there. But what they'd done is, instead of putting forward my reasons for use of force, they'd just said I'd acted in self-defence. And I was staggered by this, because clearly I'm not just, yes, there's an element of self-defence in there, but I'm doing my job. Now, the reason they went with self-defence is because CPS charging guidelines state that if a claim of self-defence is made, then the expectation will be that it's for a court to decide. But obviously...
So what exactly did you say in interview to provide the defence?
Well,
I say self-defence was part of it.
I said his behaviour was escalating and getting out of control. I needed to get him under control so we could get him into a cell. Words to that effect. There's at least 10 references in that interview transcript to the need to bring him under control to put him into the cell, as I've analysed over time. And it's quite clear that that's what I'm alluding to. But beyond that, the circumstances are pretty obvious that that's what it is. It's fairly self-evident that that's what I'm doing, because that's what's happened. But they've just entered a bland plea of self-defence, and CPS charging guidelines dictate where a self-defence claim is made, then the expectation is put before a court. But obviously, the offences that go to CPS claiming self-defence, ABH and above. For a common assault, there's no such guidance because it's not a CPS charging crime. So what they've done is, knowing that they can trigger that guidance, if they say I've said self-defence, CPS are expected to charge me along the same basis if it would if I'd broke his jaw or if it was a GBH or whatever, or a domestic assault or something. And they've treated it sort of on that basis, if you like. And so they've used that to trigger it and got it through. And CPS have been pretty poor and quite poorly led, but likewise, they've not seen the interview transcript and they've not seen the guy's extensive criminal history at all. So they've only got half a story, and they've not got actually my reasons for use of force either. So it's kind of, this investigation had one task. That's find out why I've hit him. And the reasons they gave as to why I've hit him were completely different to the reasons why I hit him. So, it's just a concoction, and it's totally unrealistic that they're submitted. But the most disturbing thing is, as I'm sure you're aware, in custody, Section 117 of PACE is key to everything. It's the catch-all use of force as required, as necessary. The key point being necessary. It's not just a free-for-all. But if it's necessary, if you've got a genuine policing reason to use force in custody, it's 117 of PACE. These people investigating it had no concept of that whatsoever. They had no idea. Likewise, they had no idea what my obligations as a custody sergeant were, which the professional standards department, correct me if I'm wrong, they should know what's expected of them, because what's expected of me is the professional standard. They never got there right up until the gross misconduct hearing. They never even got close to it or had any understanding of it whatsoever. It's just absolute madness. They literally decided that I was wrong and they were going to punish me. And there was nothing else in between.
Did he go to court in the end, or did you say that had been dropped, you said, didn't you? Because of the allegations against you.
And argued on the basis that he didn't know where he was or what he was doing.
That's right. Okay. Once CPS did review the full evidence, what happened from there?
Well, they insisted initially, because what happened was I went through all the unused material, and I went through I went for freedom of information, and I got loads and loads of material about loads of email communications between the investigating officer and CPS. And CPS have essentially said, send us that interview transcript, please. And he's kind of initially gone, oh, no, you don't need to see that interview transcript. You just have a look at that custody footage again. Clearly it's a crime. And they've looked at it and gone, no, we don't think it is, because they've suddenly realised that this guy's, because of my defence statement references extensive criminal history, etc., 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 they've looked into it further and married it up. So CPS then have said, send us that interview transcript, and then they got all the information together, and they quite clearly said, you've got two conflicting charges, you've got different reasons there for why here's the reasons why he said he's hit him, quite plainly, and it's way to a nicety again. You know what I mean? It's R.V. Palmer 1971. That's not going to be a crime. And they referenced that repeatedly. And they also said that, by the way, if that's a claim of self-defence, the extensive history of this guy and his prior knowledge of how violent this guy is, he would reasonably fear being assaulted again. So they threw it out, and then Derbyshire's PSD appealed it with another batch of lies, and they threw it out again, and Derbyshire's PSD appealed it again, and they appealed it to every stage right up to the Deputy Chief Constable's appeal, and that got to within something like 12 days of a preset court date in the July. So it was towards the end of June, and CPS have been trying to throw this out since March.
What grounds were they appealing on?
Anything. You name it. At one point, I've got his email, and he tried to argue, and you might, I hope you are sitting now, he tried to argue that at one point I was not acting as a police officer at the point I struck the male. Oddly, when he opened up the gross misconduct application, he began with, obviously, Sergeant Jones was acting in his responsibilities as a police officer when he struck the male, because obviously I was. But, of course, once it had been pronounced a lawful use of force and they wanted to sack me for it, they're happy to say, oh, it's lawful, so we can sack him for it. Even though they've had 9 months of arguing, it was unlawful. Madness.
So do you think it was done intentionally, withholding this information from the court and CPS?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I've got literally the emails with just barefaced lies in them. Lie after lie after lie. And I mean, you can, it's not necessarily my opinion. He was asked about it. He said it was a mistake. But he's not linked his file up, so CPS have got the opposing charges. Well, opposing charges are very difficult to overcome. You know that, I know that. Every police sergeant knows that. It's a massive obstacle. His criminal record was extensive and very persuasive, very, very persuasive. That's not been included. My reasons for use of force, again, not included. But when the thing is for me is, if when CPS have decided we're going to throw this in the bin because we don't like this because it's not as you described it, if he'd have put his hands up and said, oh, I'm sorry, my mistake, I forgot to send you this, I've not really got an argument. It's all a mistake, innit? But no, he didn't. He just kept lying, and he kept trying to hide the evidence, and he just lied and lied and lied repeatedly and just twisted it and just tried absolutely anything. And the big thing was, every single time they appealed it, they tried to kick the can down the road to the court date. They'd got the court date already set, and by the time they submitted the final appeal, they then, and instead of actually going to court and making an appeal and providing any case progress or anything like that, they just requested repeated adjournments and just tried to adjourn their way to the trial date and threw everything else out. No case progression, nothing. They just tried to get the day in court.
Do you reckon that they were banking on you just resigning from the job?
I think they put you on. Make no mistake, I at one point thought about pleading guilty because I wanted it to end so much, even though I knew it was ridiculous, but I just wanted it to be over. But the pressure that you're under to end this process one way or another, shall we say, is, I think, what, when we talk about officers in this situation committing suicide, the desperation to get out of that situation one way or another, however it is immense. And the way they lay things down and sort of game the way through the system with adjournments and delays and that to try and get to a court date. It's like a runaway train, and that's how it feels. And the desperation to sort of just find a way to end it. I was lucky, I managed to end it, but the desperation to get there is immense, and I can see why people would. I certainly contemplated it. It's terrifying.
Okay. What had you contemplated during that point? So you've touched on there that you contemplated going guilty, for example. That was one option. What other things had gone through your head at the time?
Well, oddly, strangely, when you see a lot of dead bodies and you see a lot of suicide, which police officers do, you might have a conversation around how you might end your life. And I think we've all sort of said we'd like to do it peacefully with a nice single malt and a load of tablets or whatever gentle way of expiry. And the strange thing for me was that my only way out of it was going to be hanging myself. And I've been to hanging, and it's gruesome. It's a nasty way to go. And I felt so bad that I literally thought it's the final punishment and it's the only way out. So coming back from that's difficult, It kind of changes your perspective in life a bit. But it's a nasty business. And I think that one of the reasons I wrote the book is because it kind of works on two levels. The other side of police corruption. One is that police complaints is a corrupt business, and there are certainly a lot of corruption within the people that they're finding guilty of misconduct. But the other side of it is, I think policing's been dehumanised in recent years. I think police have been made out to be bad people. They're all corrupt. They're all bent. They're all whatever. And I wanted to put some meat on the bones to say, look, police officers are human beings, and if you keep kicking them, you can kick them to pieces. And I think I wanted to paint a picture of just how nasty this is, because it, quite frankly, as far as I was concerned, it destroyed all the value I'd got in my persona, if you like, in my life, all my qualities, just evaporated in a day. And it's so unpleasant to have to deal with that, to go from being one of the good guys, if you like, a standard bearer, if you like, to being a criminal. And it's like being dropped into an abyss. And it's awful. It's absolutely awful.
What were your thoughts around the fact that your case was getting attention in the press?
Well, I was quite lucky because during COVID, I don't think there was much press coverage. It got some press coverage at the gross misconduct. I don't think my time on bail or the charge or anything, as I was aware, made it into the local papers. But the gross misconduct hearing made it into the papers.
Okay. Moving on to the gross misconduct. Before we do, what do you think the force were trying to achieve by repeated appeals to the court? And
I think if I'm honest, now I've stepped away from it, and you get a different perspective, and I think you can look at the reality that we're dealing with in policing in the country as a whole, really. Is that we now, if you like, we've succumbed to politics by ideology. We've got global multiculturalism and left-wing wokeism or whatever, and that's embedded in the public sector and throughout the upper echelons of the public sector. And I think it's almost like an ideology, and you've got your disciples of it that want to appear devout, that we as senior police officers are woke and we are committed to multiculturalism, and we won't tolerate officers punching people in the face because that looks bad. And so there's a moralistic sort of holier than thou approach, which means that they're effectively working on a different scheme that's entirely separate from the law and the conduct regulations and actual common sense, which half the police force is adhering to conduct regulations and the law. And then you've got a certain amount, particularly the IOPC are appalling, that are just embedded in this culture of we don't want to do anything with bad optics because we want to say we're holier than thou. And I think it's almost like presenting as a devout sort of commitment to reducing use of force or whatever, that we won't tolerate this. And it's just constant virtue signalling. And I think that's become the objective in policing, in across the public sector. It's why, it's why teachers aren't teaching and nurses aren't nursing and police aren't policing, is because we've got another suite of objectives which are all based around virtue signalling and sort of ideology.
The gross misconduct hearing, then, you must have known or had some sort of inkling that was coming once their appeals were being rebuffed time and time again.
Yeah. Celebrations were short-lived. Yeah.
Tell me about that then. So you must have been relieved the fact that it was thrown out of court, no case to answer.
Yeah.
But how would you go from how would you go from the relief and I guess you'd said about celebrations. It probably was a bit of a celebration, but how would you go from that to then being thrown in front of a gross misconduct hearing?
Well, I think probably I tend to think a lot of people get led by the hand through this via the solicitor or whatever. I didn't. I'm what might be known as, shall we say, a bit bolshy. I think we say round here. And I wasn't being led by my solicitor. I wanted to have hold of my solicitor for not fighting my corner hard enough, to be quite frank. And he was a decent guy. But the reality is, I've had shouting matches with my solicitor over this and sort of banged the drum a little bit. And prior to being served with the gross misconduct file, I'd already lodged several complaints with the head of professional standards and said, he has lied. This investigating officer, Rick Layton, has lied repeatedly. He's lied here, he's lied here, he's lied here, he's lied here. And then they let him submit a gross misconduct file after 9 months of lying and pretending that my use of force was unlawful. He submitted a gross misconduct file saying he's claimed self-defence, and the head of professional standards quite rightly said, well, self-defence doesn't fall under police conduct regulations. At which point he said, oh yeah, well, he's used Section 3 Criminal Law Act. Well, Section 3 Criminal Law Act means it's not a crime and never was a crime. So he changed. He literally sent the file back to him and he resubmitted it saying, yes, he's acted under Section 3 Criminal Law Act, which means my actions were lawful all along. And where I'm accusing him of lying and saying he's lied and lied and lied and lied, nobody saw fit to say, why are you now saying his use of force was lawful when you've had 9 months of arguing it wasn't? So I was spitting feathers at this stage and literally on a warpath with them. But then, of course, it being professional standards, I've got to wait several months for the gross misconduct hearing, haven't I?
I'm so surprised it went to gross misconduct hearing, to be honest, after the charade that you've told me about with the criminal court.
Yeah, it's mad. It's mad. And it got to the point where my solicitor said he wasn't going to represent me if I kept fighting him. Because what happened was they gave me the file, and I looked at this file, and it's got however many pages in it. Literally, I looked at it for 10 minutes, and then I looked at it for another 10 minutes, and another. There's no evidence of misconduct in it at all. There's no evidence of criminality or misconduct contained in that file at all. And the rationale for authorising it from the head of professional standards didn't mention any evidence at all. It was all around his vulnerability and virtue signalling around we must protect the vulnerable. So essentially what you've got is that although what I'd done was nothing, and it really was nothing, it's a mockingbird, and they've essentially used it like that and extolled his vulnerability to great extent, and they've ignored the fact that he's the most violent person I've ever met, and so we then went to a gross misconduct, and I don't really understand it because the head of professional standards is under an obligation, if it appears there's no case, is under an obligation to bin it. And I said, you've not got any evidence in this case. There is no statement, there is no account, there's nothing that says I've done anything wrong whatsoever contained in this case. Still went forward.
What was the panel's view when there was summing up?
It's probably the closest I've ever come to a commendation. It literally, I just had to think there was something that they said they've got a very expensive barrister on the day. It was a good guy, actually, and he was a good barrister, but they paid a lot of money to have this guy, several £1,000s to have him there for a few days. And he sat there in my gross misconduct hearing and said, use of force could have been avoided if you'd put him in the cell earlier, Sergeant Jones. And I said, I was trying to avoid putting him in the cell by use of force, by trying to establish some form of cooperation with him. If I'd have put him in the cell earlier, I'd have had to use force to put him in the cell because he won't support his own body weight and he just lashes out at everybody. So please tell me how I could have avoided using force to put him in the cell. And he sat there in silence. I said, well, what magic? I says, are we levitating him into the cell? How do we get him in the cell without use of force? Nothing. Because clearly use of force couldn't have been avoided on some level, could it? It's just inevitable. And at the point it became inevitable, I used force. That's life, you know. But the panel it was one of the later ones where they had what was then a QC. I think it's obviously now a KC. Jane Jones, QC, very bright and articulate lady, by the way. And she sat and summed it up and said that essentially it was quite obvious I was very good at my job. I had exceptional knowledge of my role. There was clearly no misconduct. There was no gross misconduct. My actions were proportionate and necessary, and that my conduct throughout was pretty much flawless and took into account all his needs. And and you think, well, 2-year investigation, and you know, and you get to the end of it. It's amazing, really.
You've talked about raising issues with the head of professional standards, but was there any investigation into the PSD officers who built the case against you?
No. I complained endlessly. I complained to the head of professional standards, swept it under the carpet. I've complained to the chief inspector of professional standards. He swept it under the carpet. I've provided him all the emails. I've provided him the proof. He has perverted the course of justice. If somehow he would have escaped that, he has a misconduct in public office allegation. Proven guilty, 100%, no doubt whatsoever. I used to weigh up thousands and thousands of evidential cases. He's guilty. He's definitely guilty. I've got the file. I've published the file or part of the file on Amazon. You can read it for £1 on Amazon. It's all there. It's as plain as day.
You'll have to send me the link to that. I'll put it in the podcast listing.
I published the book, and they sort of, Derbyshire being Derbyshire, said, oh no, we don't know anything about that. That's not happened. That's not really happened. So then a week or two later, I just published a document which just showed all the lies and all the stuff he'd done, all the emails and things. So, but the thing is I've complained to the head of professional standards. I've complained to a variety of people. I've complained to the chief constable. Chief constable did nothing about it. Absolutely. She's retiring this week. Did nothing about it. And the thing about it, when you're complaining to these people, they should be sat in horror. They should be thinking, why has this happened to this officer? Why have they used false evidence and withheld evidence to try and prosecute my officer? No surprise. Not done anything about it. Wouldn't even give me a timescale to look into it. Chief constable. So then I complained to the then Police and Crime Commissioner, Angelique Foster, who just simply, and the thing they hide behind is the caveat in the conduct regulations that says police officers have got no right to complain. And she instantly sent me a letter back saying, you've got no right to complain. And I said, are you serious? You know, are you really just dismissing this on the back of that? This is a crime. This is a series of crimes. You know, you can't just dismiss it on that. So are you really sure, Mrs. Police and Crime Commissioner Angelique Foster, are you really sure that you want to dismiss this on the grounds that I've got no complaint when I'm making a criminal complaint? Because on that basis, they can burgle my house, they can steal my car, they can rape my wife and just get away with it because I'm a police officer. No. The threshold where the right to complain becomes valid is when it's a crime, because we're all equal under the law. We've all got rights as victims of crime. They've committed a crime. I'm reporting a crime. They're duty bound to investigate that crime. So their conduct collectively is criminal.
The officers that built the case against you, are they still in the job?
No. I've been absent through sickness for a while, and I went in to they called me in to explain my sickness. So I explained my sickness with an MG11 complaint as to what he'd done. And he left the organisation 9 days later, after I think he'd been 30 years as a police officer and then something like 10 in PSD. So 40-year association with the firm ended 9 days later.
Were you ever told why that happened? Or
No,
was it
no.
just sheer coincidence?
Essentially, that's what I've been left to make of it. There's not been anything from them that said, "Oh, we've done this, we've done that." There's no acknowledgement. Everything they've done has just been to kick the can down the road and pretend it's not happened. Much like, I think the thing is, it's this ideology thing again. They've got this ideology, and it goes against their ideology. A bit like if the current government were to have a full grooming gangs inquiry, that would go against the global multiculturalism ideology. So they're never going to do it. It's blasphemy to them, I think. So they just sort of pretended,
At what point did you leave the job?
A couple of years ago, because I suffer with PTSD, and basically I was just a mess, really. And it was sort of when at the end of all this, and here's the odd thing is, they say, right, are you coming back to work then? And I sort of said, well, if I'm coming back to work, I'm going to kill several people. I'm going to kick that professional standards office door off the hinges, and I'm going to banjo them all, because I'd lost it at that point. I'd absolutely lost it. So they referred me to the force doctor, who then said, yeah, your brain's had a bit of an overload here, and you're not very good.
So was the PTSD as a result of all this stuff within the job, or?
I think if I'm honest, I didn't know, but I think I'd had some issues before, and I didn't know. I'd had some dizzy spells and stuff like this, and brain fog and that a few years before, and I never knew what it was. I thought it was vertigo or whatever, and I had all these tests, and obviously when I got charged, I was struggling to stand up at that stage. I'd gone completely dizzy and all this kind of caper, and I'm thinking, what's happening? I'm just not functioning.
With this investigation then, both the criminal and misconduct, did colleagues stand by you?
I think, probably in my case, I'm quite insular and always have been. So there's a small number of people that did. And you can't thank those people enough. Superb, absolutely superb. I think the rest of them, I think there's a tendency to sort of not shun you as such. I don't think anybody deliberately shuns you, but I think people don't want to be associated because you're on the wrong side of the line,
Did you get any support from the Federation during all this?
Well, I actually wasn't in the Federation. I had my support through Derbyshire Benevolent Trust and a guy called Ian Godfrey there who was superb, absolutely superb, to be fair.
How come you weren't part of the Federation?
I think a lot of people have lost faith in it and don't believe that, it's a toothless tiger, I think, nowadays. And I think when it's also the financial sort of mismanagement of the federation's a problem, that people don't really want to pay the subs for something they don't feel they're getting supported. And I think that's kind of how it was. So I'd not been a member of the federation for a while, but I'd got this cover with the Benevolent Trust.
What should change in how use of force investigations are handled, in your view?
Sorry, say that again.
What should change in relation to how use of force investigations are handled?
Well, I think the thing for me is it's relatively simple. You've got to look at all this virtue signalling, all this ideology and all this wokeness. It's an irrelevance when it comes down to what you're looking at. What you're looking at is a set of conduct regulations and a set of laws. That's a set standard. So when you have this moment where they've managed to charge a police officer with whatever, and they say, this officer's fallen short of our standards, it's rubbish. It's not your standards. It's a criminal standard. It's one standard. But they're sort of implying that our standards are higher than anybody else's standards, so they can be virtue signalling about it all day. Well, it's nonsense. All the virtue signalling around it, all the ideology needs to go. It needs to be a simple, objective, what is the standard that this officer is expected to do on the day? And you've got to have a term of reference for that. Because it's a professional standards investigation, you've got to know what the exact expectations of that officer was on the day. Otherwise, you've not ascertained the professional standard. If you don't do that, your investigations fail completely. And they certainly never did it with me. But beyond that, you've got to be objective. It doesn't matter what public opinion wants or what you want to do. You've just got to look at it. I mean, I don't think anybody would ever argue, whether you're anti-police, pro-police, whether you hate me, whether you think I deserve punishing, whatever. Nobody would argue that I deserve to be punished on the basis of a false and misleading set of evidence. Why would anybody? Nobody should be subjected to that, no matter what job you do.
Do you think files should be independently audited before charging decisions are made?
I think my view of it in Derbyshire was that because there's a reference in the book, there's a reference to a couple of other cases as well. And a reference to the officer who investigated it trying to sweep an allegation under the carpet, by the way, which was publicised. It's been seen a million times on YouTube. And it was the same guy who tried to get one of his mates off headbutting somebody in the street only a few weeks before he started with my investigation. And my view was that Derbyshire's professional standards at that time, I don't know if things have changed since, but at that time, not fit to operate in the criminal sphere at all. Not even close, not competent, not trustworthy, an absolute shambles. And someone's got to get in and say, listen, it's a set standard. You will work to a set standard or you won't work at all. And how you do that, I don't know, because there's a mask of dishonesty around it, unfortunately. And unfortunately, the IOPC are probably even worse and less willing to tackle corruption. There's nothing worse than the IOPC. They're an absolute disgrace.
What about PSDs having to pass the file on to a different force for an independent audit?
I think there's merit in that argument, but if I'm honest, I went through my entire police career and I've decided on thousands and thousands of people whether they should be charged or whatever. And at no point have I ever thought, I don't like him, so I'm going to charge him, or I know this person, I'm not going to. It's what evidence have we got? You just follow the evidence, and it should be completely objective and not be set by any agenda or anything, but it isn't.
What advice would you give to cops that are currently under investigation?
I think that some of them, certainly ones I've known, are kind of led by the hand, and they get piecemeal legal advice from the solicitor as they go through the process, and just do as they're told throughout. And I think the reality is, you yourself have got to take charge of this. You've got to fight yourself. If you think, what I would say is, if someone's obviously guilty, then all right, they might want to try and get the best case scenario for them out of it. But I wouldn't want to defend anybody who's guilty. If they've done wrong, they've done wrong. But if you're like me, if you're what you believe wholeheartedly that this is just a mess and you shouldn't be subjected to this process, you need to fight them every step of the way. You need to really take them on and really, draw a line in the sand and just say, thou shalt not pass. Otherwise, you'll be trampled underfoot.
I know you'd mentioned during the misconduct hearing about having the words with the barrister, because I think he was trying to challenge your decision making in the use of force and everything. But have you reflected on that since, and would you have done anything differently that day?
Do you know, I think I've always thought, and I said on the day, I said, listen, I'm not saying that I'm perfect or that my judgment's perfect or that I've had the best idea that policing's ever seen. I said, this is what I've done. I've done it, it worked. I did it with this intention. Do you know what? I'm not particularly happy about it, but, and I also appreciate I took my eye off the ball and I've made a bit of a pig's ear of the situation. I'm not, it happens in custody. Custody is chaos at times. And I think, maybe I could have handled the situation a lot better. No question. As for whether I don't know at the end of the day, because it's a split-second decision, and I did what was available to me. And when he was presented in front of me in that situation, I thought, well, I don't know any other Home Office approved technique other than a jab on the nose, because he's sat in a chair, you know?
Mm. You've touched on your book a couple of times during the conversation. What's your book called?
It's The Other Side of Police Corruption.
Why did you decide to write it?
I think the thing for me was that I knew that, having been to Iraq in 2003 for that invasion, I wrote a book about that, and I found it a really cathartic exercise. And it meant that what was swimming in my head endlessly was suddenly committed on paper as a matter of record, and I didn't need to process it anymore. And it was more around getting it out of my head. And then I started to work into it and think, actually, I've got a pretty decent book here, you know? But I'd written most of it by the time I decided it was going to be a book.
Oh, right, okay. Was it about setting the record straight as well?
I think... I suppose. I think I've referred to it as a matter of public record. And I think it's that as much as anything. Yeah, so yeah, I thought it was important that there was a record of it, should it ever arise in the future. It's something that I think needed to be recorded.
So that's The Other Side of Police Corruption by yourself, Lee Jones. I believe it's available on Amazon, priced currently at £7.69.
Something like that, yeah. I don't look at my own listings.
Yeah, it's a bit random. £7.69, but it's not expensive. It sounds like a cracking read.
I'm told so, but likewise, I think they wouldn't tell me if they didn't like it, would they?
I'm sure they would. There's plenty of opinionated people out there.
Absolutely.
So what's next for you?
I've got a part-time job, and I'm taking it easy for the minute. I'm sort of working out what to do next. You know what I mean? I'm in that sort of in-between spell.
Okay, no, sounds good. Sounds good. Well, I really appreciate you coming on to the podcast. I'm sure a lot of the listeners and viewers are going to find it really useful and shocking at the same time.
Thanks ever so much, Paul. Really good to meet you.
Yeah, you too.